In the grand halls of the Galactic Council, few names carried the same weight as Kaz-Thol, the last living warrior of the Vexer people. He wasn't just feared, he was a living myth, the kind of being whose presence alone could silence rooms, derail debates, and scatter seasoned diplomats into hushed corners. Standing nearly 4 meters tall, clad in ancient obsidian-scaled armor that seemed to consume light rather than reflect it, Kaz-Thol was more than just a reminder of a long-forgotten war. He was its last echo. The deep rumble of his metallic boots striking the polished crystalline floors of the council's central chambers was enough to send nervous glances ricocheting from one corner of the room to another. Delegates from 200 star systems froze mid-sentence, daring not even to breathe too loud as the massive figure walked by, his eyes fixed forward, cold and unreadable. Even among the most diverse species in the known galaxy, his arrival was a spectacle of awe and unease. Beings with feathers, scales, tentacles, and telepathic speech all knew to stay out of his way. His seat in the council chamber was the only one built specifically to support his massive frame or relic from a time when the Vexer Empire had been instrumental in building the very structure of the council itself. And now, that same chair served as a solitary monument to a civilization that had burned away in the fires of its own battles, leaving behind a single survivor. One who had not only outlived his people, but had personally ended 17 separate armed conflicts across the stars in the past 100 years. And each one, without fail, became a whispered tale of ruthless efficiency and brutal peace. It was into this environment of tension and ancient history that humanity was invited to participate in full diplomatic proceedings for the first time. Many species had written the humans off as reckless newcomers, ambitious, yes, but tragically naive. So when the station's automated system announced the arrival of Earth's ambassador, most delegates barely bothered to look up. They expected another wide-eyed representative dressed in ceremonial robes, perhaps already shaking with nervous energy before even reaching the speaking floor. Instead, the chamber doors slid open and in walked Alexandra Torres. From the moment she stepped into the room, something shifted. It wasn't just that she was human, there had been humans in observation roles before. No, it was her presence. Her posture was confident without being arrogant. Her eyes scanned the room with sharp calculation, but also with curiosity. She wore a crisp, dark blue diplomatic uniform with silver trim that reflected the council's ambient lighting. Her long, dark hair was braided with precision, not for vanity but for order. She radiated control, intelligence, and most importantly, she showed no fear. As she crossed the floor, she did something no delegate had dared to do in generations. She looked directly at Kaz-Thol. Most avoided eye contact with him. The Vexer's crystal blue eyes had stared down Starfleets and silenced revolts. But Alexandra met his gaze without hesitation, and perhaps even more daring, she smiled slightly before bowing to High Elder Valara and addressing the council. High Elder Valara, she began, her voice clear and composed, distinguished members of the Galactic Council. It's an unexpected honor to be in the presence of the legendary Kaz-Thol himself. The chamber froze. Several delegates shifted uncomfortably. A few outright cringed. No one acknowledged the Vexer representative that directly. It simply wasn't done. Over centuries, protocol had evolved, some might say calcified into unspoken rules. Rule 1, don't provoke the Vexer. Rule 2, don't talk to the Vexer. Rule 3, definitely don't call attention to the fact that the Vexer is in the room. Yet here was this young human, standing in front of the most feared being in the known galaxy, and offering him recognition like she would any other council member. Kaz-Thol leaned forward slowly. His massive ceremonial chair creaked under the motion, and his armor caught the light for the first time, casting brief reflections across the chamber walls. "You know of me, human?" he asked, his voice low and echoing, laced with both amusement and warning. "Ambassador Torres," she corrected gently, her tone respectful but firm. "And yes, I've studied the historical archives thoroughly, Centaur Prime, the Relian mediation, the Novarian seed bank defense. Your actions have shaped the galaxy more than most care to admit." There was a sound from Kaz-Thol, then a low, guttural noise like steel grinding on steel. At first, no one was sure what it meant. Only after a few seconds did it become clear he was laughing. Not mockingly, and not derisively, but genuinely. "You speak of war and death with a certain ease, Ambassador Torres," he said. "Most here prefer to bury the past under layers of bureaucracy. Humanity has learned the hard way, she replied calmly, that ignoring history, pleasant or not, is a good way to repeat it. We'd rather face it. This was the moment. The entire chamber held its breath. Casthul studied her for a long, silent moment. He had faced down warlords, armadas, and planetary coups. He had outlived every ally and adversary he had ever known. He had earned the right to dismiss any voice he didn't respect. But instead of silence or dismissal, he responded. Your species, he said slowly, barely a century in space. Already causing chaos across 3 sectors. We do have a reputation for that, Alexandra acknowledged. But sometimes chaos is what shakes old systems awake. There it was again, that unmistakable sound of steel grinding laughter, rolling deeper this time. 342 cycles, he said loud enough for the entire chamber to hear. That's how long it's been since anyone here dared to speak to me with actual substance. What followed in the next few minutes was, by every definition, historic. For centuries, the Vexer representative had been more a force of nature than a participant. He had spoken only when necessary, had voted only in matters involving potential galactic security breaches, and had never engaged in what could be considered genuine dialogue. But here he was, not just responding to a human ambassador, but actively debating, reflecting, even showing signs of curiosity. Alexandra didn't stop there. She brought up recent reports, classified and controversial, about human interactions with ancient alien artifacts in the Epsilon sector. Most species treated the incident like a diplomatic landmine. The council had avoided the topic altogether for fear of political fallout, but she asked Casthul directly, "What's your perspective on the Epsilon protocols?" she asked, her voice steady. And again, to everyone's disbelief, the Vexer responded. "Your colonists," he said, "acted correctly. The artifacts belong to a civilization older than even mine. The protective measures they used were appropriate, if a little soft-handed." Alexandra nodded, never breaking eye contact. "Would you be willing to share your people's ancient protective protocols with Earth's Historical Preservation Department? You would trust a warrior whose name terrifies 100 worlds?" he asked. "I trust the judgment of someone who has survived 10,000 years by making the right decisions," she answered plainly. That was the moment everything began to shift, not just between her and Casthul, but in the perception of the entire Galactic Council. Where once they had seen the Vexer as an immovable monument to a violent past, they now saw potential for something different, something unexpected. The rest of the meeting proceeded technically according to the agenda, but in truth it was a blur for most of the delegates. Their attention remained fixed on the impossible scene in front of them, a young human woman and an ancient alien warrior conversing not as enemies, not as adversaries, but as equals. By the time the council adjourned for the day, whispers had already spread through the station like wildfire. Some called Alexandra reckless, others dangerously bold. But one thing was certain: she had done something no one else had managed in thousands of years. She had walked straight up to the most feared being in the galaxy and started a conversation. And against every expectation, he had answered. In the days that followed her shocking debut at the Galactic Council session, Ambassador Alexandra Torres became the topic of every conversation on the station. Gossip threads lit up, diplomatic circles whispered, and entire committees were formed to evaluate protocol around interacting with the ancient Vexer warrior. But Alexandra didn't seem to care. She had made a connection with the most feared being in the galaxy, and more importantly, she saw something in him that no one else dared to look for. Casthul, on the other hand, found himself curious for the first time in centuries. It wasn't something he liked to admit. Curiosity had once led to vulnerability, and vulnerability had led to the fall of everything he had ever known. But as he reviewed the council transcripts in solitude and watched the recordings of Alexandra's speech, he felt something shift inside him. The humans, as chaotic and reckless as they were, had always amused him from a distance. But Alexandra was different. She didn't just challenge protocol, she challenged him. And he found himself wondering what her next move would be. He didn't have to wait long. Their next encounter took place in the diplomatic quarters' central plaza, a wide circular space surrounded by cafes, embassies, and observation decks. It was a place designed to encourage casual conversation between species, but few ever lingered when Casthul passed through. His presence had a way of emptying rooms even without a word. But on that particular morning, as he approached the plaza to retrieve historical data from the Vexer archives, he stopped mid-stride. There, at the center of the open courtyard, sat Alexandra Torres. She was seated at a small outdoor table in front of a human-style cafe, sipping something from a thick ceramic mug and tapping her fingers along to a quiet rhythm only she could hear. The table next to hers was empty, no surprise given the tension surrounding her new acquaintance. But what startled Casthol wasn't her solitude. It was the second cup of coffee placed directly across from her. "Most establishments clear the entire level when I arrive," he said, stepping forward. His deep voice reverberated through the stone tiles beneath their feet. Alexandra didn't flinch. Instead, she casually glanced up at him, her expression warm and entirely unshaken. "They miss out on some pretty good conversation," she replied. "Also, ID's the owner here makes the best espresso this side of Alpha Centauri. Thought you might want to try it." Casthol stared at the cup. It was absurdly small for someone of his size, more like a decorative thimble than a drinking vessel. But Alexandra said nothing more. She didn't coax or challenge him. She just took another sip from her own mug and waited. He slowly lowered himself into the seat constructed for a species half his size and carefully lifted the tiny cup between two massive armored fingers. The process was meticulous. His armor shifted slightly to allow for hand articulation, and for a moment the entire plaza seemed to freeze. When he finally brought the espresso to what passed for his faceplate and took a sip, Alexandra watched with a quiet smile. "Well?" she asked. There was a pause. "Acceptable," he replied. And just like that, the ice cracked. What followed were a series of meetings that no one had expected and that no one could stop talking about. Alexandra and Casthol were seen walking the station's observation decks, exchanging information across datapads, and even arguing, cordially, somehow, in the library about historical timelines and alien cultural rituals. It didn't take long before whispers turned into rumors and rumors turned into full-on speculation. Why is she spending so much time with him? Is she trying to manipulate him? Is he changing? The truth, however, was far simpler and far more profound. Casthol had lived in isolation for so long, he'd almost forgotten what it meant to talk to someone without layers of fear, ceremony, or tactical positioning. Alexandra, in her very human way, ignored all of that. She didn't shrink from his presence. She didn't idolize him either. She asked questions. She challenged his assumptions. She even joked. First time she made a quip about his armor overheating under diplomatic pressure, Casthol had stared at her like she'd blow her mind. But then he laughed, and that laugh, deep and low, a sound that made passing maintenance drones pause in confusion, echoed through the station for the second time in a week. It would not be the last. During formal events, the growing friendship didn't go unnoticed. At one reception, a Relian diplomat approached Alexandra, his voice low and urgent. "Ambassador Torres," he whispered, glancing across the room to where Casthol stood silently, his crystal blue eyes observing everything. "We must discuss your approach," she asked, "to the Vexer. There are protocols, traditions. You are breaking precedent." Alexandra turned to face the diplomat fully, her voice calm but pointed. "Protocols based on what?" On caution," he stammered. "On fear. And how's that been working out for you?" she asked plainly. He had no answer, but someone else had been listening. Casthol stood across the chamber, unmoving. But Alexandra knew his hearing, enhanced over millennia, had caught every word. That evening, they met again on the station's upper deck, where the stars shimmered through transparent shielding panels. Alexandra was already seated when he arrived, her legs tucked beneath her and a datapad resting on her lap. "You caused quite a stir today," he said, stepping into her peripheral view. "Back to Ambassador, are we?" she replied with a smile. He paused, then slowly sat beside her. "Alexandra. That's better." They sat in silence for a moment, watching a nearby trade ship glide past. "You don't fear me?" he said eventually. "No," she replied. "Why?" She turned toward him, serious now, "Because fear prevents understanding. And I'd rather understand even if it's dangerous." He tilted his head slightly, absorbing her words. "On Earth," she continued, "we have this saying, the fear of a thing is often worse than the thing itself. Most of us would rather know the truth and face it than hide from something just because it's scary." Casthol processed that. Then, in a rare show of openness, he replied, "My people were not always warriors, you know." She nodded. "I've read that. Artists, philosophers, teachers. Before the wars," he said softly. Before the silence. There was something in his voice, an ache so ancient it felt like it had grown roots in his chest. "Well," she said gently, "maybe it's time the galaxy remembered that part of your people too." In the weeks that followed, Their interactions continued not out of obligation or strategy, but because they genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Alexandra introduced him to earth music, something called jazz that he claimed gave him tactical confusion. He taught her traditional Vexer meditation techniques, which she tried earnestly, despite falling over more than once. They argued about politics. They swapped ancient texts and current news. She even showed him how to play chess, though he called it a primitive form of tactical projection, and then promptly lost 3 games in a row. And all the while, the station changed around them. People stopped fleeing the hallways when Casthol walked through. They started nodding, greeting, even asking him questions. The shift was slow but undeniable, and it was all because of Alexandra. For Casthol, something even deeper was changing. He had not intended to form any kind of connection, least of all with a human. But her persistence, her insight, her refusal to treat him like a monster, it all chipped away at the walls he had so carefully constructed. One night, as they sat beneath the starlit dome, he turned to her and said, "You are changing things." "Good," she replied. "Because from what I've seen, the old way wasn't working. He was quiet for a long time. My isolation," he began, "was once a choice. After my people fell, I saw no point in forming bonds that would only be broken. And now," she asked. He looked at her then, not just at her face, but at what she represented. Now, he thought, I am not so sure. The friendship that formed between Alexandra Torres and Casthol was more than just an anomaly. It was a signal, a flare in the night sky, a sign that even the most feared and solitary among us are not beyond reach. That sometimes all it takes to break centuries of silence is one voice that refuses to be afraid. The Galactic Council Station, a marvel of crystalline architecture and interstellar engineering, was built to represent peace. Orbiting the quiet heart of a neutral star system, it had been designed to feel untouchable, shielded, monitored, and patrolled with surgical precision. Yet for all its brilliance, the station had grown complacent. After centuries of diplomacy and protocol, its security was no longer battle-hardened but bureaucratically efficient. It relied too heavily on scheduled patrols, automated systems, and the assumption that diplomacy would shield it better than armor ever could. Which is why, on the third shift of a seemingly routine cycle, everything came crashing down. It began with sirens, sharp, sudden, and so rarely heard that some assumed it was a drill. But the voice that followed, calm and eerily composed, confirmed the truth. Multiple unauthorized vessels detected. Breach in progress. Security compromised in sectors 7 through 12. All personnel proceed to designated safety zones. Ambassador Alexandra Torres was not in a safety zone. She was inside the council chamber when the first tremors of the breach rumbled beneath her boots. And she wasn't alone. From his private quarters across the station, Casthol moved before the announcement finished. Armor pedals shifted and locked into place with mechanical precision, adapting for combat mode. His ancient instincts, sharpened by wars long buried in history, activated without hesitation. He opened a secure channel. "Alexandra." Her voice came through almost immediately, calm, but with the unmistakable sound of weapon fire in the background. "Council chamber. They're trying to break through. They're after the ancient archives. The archives, of course." Deep beneath the council floor lay the sealed vault's databanks filled with historical records, forbidden technologies, and the cultural legacies of hundreds of species. Some of those records, Casthol knew, belonged to his own people. "They're secure," he responded, adjusting direction without breaking stride. "I'm en route." "Funny thing about that," Alexandra replied, dragging something heavy behind her from the sound of it. "I've already sealed off most of the major corridors to buy time." "Including the secondary route you'd normally take?" Casthul's eyes narrowed. "Then how do you expect me to reach you?" She didn't hesitate. "Remember that maintenance shaft you said was too small for your armor?" He stopped. "You cannot be serious. Think of it as an opportunity to prove that the mighty Vexer warrior can adapt to any situation." He stared at the narrow tunnel, not built for someone of his size, let alone fully armored. But her voice in his ear, laced with tension and that maddening hint of humor, gave him no room for pride. And so the warrior who had once stared down entire fleets got on his hands and knees and crawled. Metal scraped against metal, sparks flew, panels bent and cracked under his weight. Somewhere, deep in the control rooms of the station, a technician monitoring internal cams dropped their coffee in disbelief. When Casthol finally emerged in the council chamber's upper level, he looked like a beast torn straight from ancient myth. Armor scraped, stance coiled, eyes burning. Below him, Alexandra had transformed the stately chamber into a battlefield. Tables had been overturned into barricades. Security drones had been reprogrammed and repositioned. Emergency lights cast long shadows over centuries-old mosaics. She didn't look like a diplomat anymore. She looked like someone ready to make a last stand. "You look like you could use some help," she said, never taking her eyes off the doors that glowed red-hot from cutting torches. "You appear to have everything under control," Kazol replied, dropping down beside her. "Though your barricade design is questionable. Feel free to critique my technique after we survive this," she shot back. Then the doors exploded. Molten shards of metal sprayed the chamber. Pirates poured through in waves, some in stealth armor, others dragging heavy weapons clearly not designed for enclosed spaces. But they weren't ready for what waited behind the barricades. Security drones unleashed suppressive fire from behind repurposed furniture. Alexandra crouched low, used her diplomatic datapad to overload enemy electronics, a function never intended by its designers. Kazol, towering over the chaos, unleashed ancient weapons embedded in his armor plasma arcs, kinetic bursts, and a defense system so advanced it looked like magic to the untrained eye. And still, they kept coming. As the tide of battle surged back and forth, Kazol caught Alexandra's eye. "The Relian," he growled. "You were right, weren't you, Delegate Zinel?" she confirmed grimly. "He was too interested in our meetings, too curious about your schedule." Pattern recognition 101. Through the smoke, a figure emerged taller than the others, clad in powered armor laced with weapon mounts. The voice that came from its speakers was cold and familiar. "Quite the team you two make," said the Relian delegate, "the ancient warrior and the human upstart. You've disrupted years of careful planning." Alexander didn't blink. "Selling out the council to pirates? That's a hell of a legacy." His reply came in the form of missile fire. Kazol moved on instinct. He threw himself in front of Alexandra, absorbing the full brunt of the blast. The impact drove him back, armor scorched, systems flaring. But he stood. "You would risk your life for a human," the Relian sneered. Kazol's voice cut through the smoke, filled with unshakable clarity. "This is how high the Vexer may rise again." Then, with a sound like thunder cracking open the heavens, his armor activated systems not used since the last galactic war. Lights flared. Energy built. And for one terrifying minute, the chamber became a battlefield remembered only in legends. When station security finally arrived, the council chamber was nearly unrecognizable. Smoke curled through shattered marble. Pirates lay restrained or unconscious. The Relian's armor was reduced to slag. And at the center of it all stood Casthul, burned, battered but unbowed, carefully helping Alexandra to her feet. "Next time," he rumbled, "perhaps we should discuss your contingency plans in advance. Where's the fun in that?" She grinned, brushing debris from her uniform. Their laughter, shared in the ruins of battle, wasn't just unexpected, it was revolutionary. In the days that followed, as reconstruction teams poured into the station and council officials debated the political fallout, something quieter and far more important was happening in the background. The myth of Casthul, the unapproachable warrior of silence and fear, was shifting. He wasn't just a relic of war anymore. He was a protector, a mentor, a symbol of what could happen when even the most ancient of beings chose connection over solitude. And Alexandra, she became the spark behind it all. The quiet aftermath of the pirate attack brought more than repairs. Yes, the structural damage was extensive. Yes, emergency protocols were updated. And yes, the Relian delegate's betrayal launched a cascade of political reforms across 3 sectors. But the most profound change couldn't be measured in schematics or diplomatic legislation. It was something far older, something almost forgotten. It started with a question. They were sitting on the observation deck again, Casthul and Alexandra Torres, staring out into the galactic void. The stars outside shimmered like spilled gemstones, and the station's lights had dimmed for the night cycle, leaving a hush in the air. In that stillness, Alexandra turned and asked softly, "What was your people's name for the stars?" Casthul blinked. He hadn't thought about it in millennia. "Kelvarian," he said finally. "It means the memory of fire. We believe that stars were the echoes of the first sparks of creation." "That's beautiful," Alexandra replied, her voice tinged with awe. "Why isn't that in the archives?" He was silent for a moment. Then, with a heaviness that settled between them, he answered, "Because no one ever asked. That was the moment it truly began the revival of a lost culture. And it wasn't launched with trumpets or grand declarations, but with the persistent curiosity of one human who refused to let the past stay buried. Alexandra asked questions no one had dared ask in thousands of years, not just about battles or strategy, but about art, music, architecture, emotion, memory. What the Vexer were before the wars. Kazdul had always thought of his past as something sealed in stone, fossilized in records no one would ever care to read. But Alexandra didn't approach it like a researcher. She approached it like a friend, like someone who genuinely wanted to understand. And so slowly, he began to share. There was a city, he said one day in the private training hall. He had just corrected her meditation stance for the third time. Vexer Prime. Its spires were grown from living crystal, resonating with harmonic frequencies so pure, they were said to calm even the most restless minds. Alexandra sat on the mat across from him, sweat beading on her brow from attempting the physically demanding poses. She listened, enraptured. "Grown?" she asked. "Not built. We shaped them?" He nodded. Our architecture wasn't constructed, it was cultivated. Every building harmonized with its neighbors, like members of a choir. They responded to sound, movement, even thought. Each citizen's home reflected their personality. We believed cities should breathe with the people who lived in them. She was stunned. "Ants. I've never read anything like that." "You wouldn't have," he said. That knowledge was sealed after the fall, not because it was dangerous, but because it was painful. As their sessions continued, Alexandra began studying the ancient texts. He shared the few that survived the collapse of Vexer civilization. The language was complex, structured almost like music. It took time, patience, and a stubborn refusal to give up, but she began to read them. Not just read them, feel them. One night she showed up at the training room with a datapad and a gleam in her eyes. "I found your poetry." Tessa looked at her puzzled. "Our what?" "Third Dynasty?" she said, scrolling. "Love poems." I had to decrypt half the file structure, but there it was, verses written in harmonic glyphs. "Did you know Vexer romance was once considered the most intricate in the galaxy?" He blinked. "No. You wrote metaphor into vibration, rhythm into emotion. You composed feeling like it was music." Kazdul, the warrior feared across hundreds of worlds, the enforcer of peace through overwhelming force, actually looked flustered. "We were not always warriors," he said quietly. "Before the Great Wars, we were more." Alexandra sat beside him, their datapads between them, open to old texts and recovered fragments. "Tell me about them," she said. "Not the summaries, not the military records. Tell me what you remember." And so he did. He told her about walking through the gardens of Kelvassur, where blossoms opened only when sung to. He described the sound of a planetary sunrise on his homeworld, how it resonated through the stone itself, like the planet was waking up. He spoke of teachers who taught meditation through dance and builders who wove philosophy into the construction of bridges. He spoke of joy, of childhood, of a civilization that believed strength came from unity, not dominance. And for the first time in over 10,000 years, he said their names out loud. Alexandra listened like a historian, but also like a friend. And then she did something unexpected. She began sharing in return. She told him about Earth, about how her people danced in the streets after long wars ended, how they argued, protested, fell apart, and stitched themselves back together again. She told him about coffee on cold mornings, about rain that made people pause mid-stride just to feel it, about art that didn't always make sense, and music that healed without words. "We're chaotic," she said with a chuckle, "but we love hard. We break things, but we fix them too. And sometimes, we poke the universe just to see what happens." Kazdul studied her for a long moment. "You remind me of what we used to be." The memory restoration didn't stay private for long. Word spread quietly at first about the ancient warrior who was meeting with a human diplomat, not to discuss military treaties, but to exchange poetry and meditation techniques. Delegates from other species began peeking into their sessions. A few brave ones asked to join. Alexandra began translating parts of the ancient Vexer texts into Galactic Standard and uploading them to the station's cultural archive. She created a cross-reference guide that linked Vexer philosophies with similar concepts in other civilizations. She held discussion forums in the evenings, where Vexer architecture was compared to Centurion song geometry in Earth's sacred cathedrals, and slowly, beautifully, pieces of a lost world began to resurface. One of the most touching moments came when a young Proxim student presented Kaz with a holographic reconstruction of a Vexer city based on Alexandra's translated texts. The shimmering towers and vibrating bridges weren't perfect, but they pulsed with color and movement, like a living memory come to life. For a long time, Kaz said nothing. Then he whispered, "That is the sound of home." He didn't cry, his people didn't cry. But Alexandra swore she saw his eyes shimmer brighter than usual. Soon after, Kaz requested a full cultural restoration project for the Vexer archives. He authorized the unsealing of hundreds of locked files, architecture, philosophy, literature, even dance rituals. The files had been hidden not because they were irrelevant, but because the memory of what was lost had once been too much to bear. Not anymore. A month later, the station hosted its first Vexer Cultural Night. Delegates arrived cautiously, expecting ceremonial rigidity. Instead, they found holographic art installations, music that shifted in tone based on audience movement, and dancers for multiple species attempting Vexer-style synchronized flow. In the center of the room, surrounded by flowers shaped like harmonic spirals, stood Kaz, not in battle armor, but in ceremonial robes, a recreation of those once worn by Vexer scholars. Deep blue, trimmed in silver, with a chest plate inscribed with the symbol for memory. Why now? One reporter asked him afterward. Because for the first time, he said, "Someone reminded me we were not built only for war." He didn't need to say her name. Everyone knew. Alexandra Torres had done something no scholar, no diplomat, no archivist had achieved in over 10 millennia. The station never truly slept, but something about the cycles after the pirate attack felt different. It wasn't just the rebuilt corridors or the reinforced security grids. It was something more subtle, more human. The very air on the Galactic Council station felt lighter. Before, whenever Counselor Castle entered a chamber, silence fell like a curtain. Conversations stalled. Delegates froze, and junior aides found reasons to be elsewhere. Centuries of conditioning made fear the default response to the towering Vexer warrior. He was a relic of war in a world obsessed with peace, a reminder of a violent past most species had chosen to forget or ignore. But now, when Casthol entered the council chamber, people didn't shrink away. They turned toward him. It started slowly, a delegate nodding respectfully instead of pretending not to see him. A junior centurion offering him a datapad rather than stammering and running out of the room. And then, in one particularly memorable session, a Proxim representative barely out of diplomatic training stood to present a proposal. Mid-sentence, they stumbled over a complex phrase, visibly nervous. In the past, such mistakes might have drawn a heavy silence from Casthol, one that would send shivers across the chamber. But this time, he leaned forward in his massive seat and said, in a voice that rumbled like a soft avalanche, "Perhaps we should examine the historical context." During the Third Dynasty, the Vexer faced a similar challenge with resource allocation across long-range colonies. The chamber held its collective breath. The young Proxim stood straighter, their eyes wide. "You would share that knowledge, Counselor?" Casthol nodded once. Knowledge grows stronger when shared. The words echoed simple, powerful, and oddly familiar. Alexandra, watching from her seat near the Earth delegation, couldn't help but smile. It was something she'd told him during one of their long discussions. Fear builds walls, but shared knowledge builds bridges. He hadn't said it at the time, but he'd remembered. Later, as the session ended and delegates filed out, Casthol called out to the young Proxim. "Come to my office after the session," he said. "We will discuss this further." The chamber lit up with a quiet energy. Not from shock, but from the sense that something foundational was changing. And it was. Casthol, once a solitary enforcer, of peace through fear, was evolving. And the entire Galactic Council was watching it happen in real time. Delegates who once dreaded his presence now sought him out for counsel. They came with questions about history, about culture, about what it meant to survive the collapse of a civilization and still find meaning. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time he was willing to try. It wasn't just policy that changed, it was perception. Before Alexandra Torres arrived, most species had viewed Casthol as a weapon, an ancient, barely restrained force of destruction tolerated only because of his past. But now, they saw him as something else entirely, a guardian, a guide, and, most remarkably, a teacher. He began giving lectures in the station's cultural wing, not about warfare, but about Vexer philosophy. He explained how his people had once believed that every conflict must be balanced by creation, that for every battle, a work of beauty should be born. That strength wasn't just the ability to destroy, but the discipline to build. Delegates came at first out of curiosity, then they returned again and again with notes and datapads full of questions. One morning, Casthol was invited to speak at the station's primary school, a request he nearly declined. "I am not suited for children," he had told Alexandra. She disagreed. "You might be surprised. Kids don't carry centuries of fear. They see what's right in front of them." He arrived in full ceremonial armor, unsure of what to expect. He left an hour later surrounded by a dozen students asking if he could come back and explain how living crystal cities work. Even the maintenance crew started treating him differently. One morning, a Relin technician offered him a steaming cup of coffee without a word. It wasn't espresso, just the standard blend humans used to stay awake during late shifts, but the gesture meant more than anyone could explain. Meanwhile, Alexandra continued to push the restoration of Vexar cultural archives. She created multilingual modules on Vexer history for the Diplomatic Training Academy. She translated lost poems into Galactic Standard. She even curated a small museum wing on the station featuring artifacts from the Vexer homeworld, items Casthol had long hidden in storage. They held an opening ceremony. Casthol stood in the center of the room, surrounded by diplomats, journalists, and students. Holographic projections showed Vexer gardens, living crystal towers, and handwritten texts in harmonic glyphs. Music played soft, melodic, composed from a fragment of recovered Vexer notation. When asked to speak, he paused. "I once believed that silence protected the past," he said. "But silence is not preservation. It is forgetting. My people deserve more than to be remembered only through war." The applause was quiet, respectful, and sincere. In diplomatic circles, Casthol's name no longer sent shivers. It invoked admiration. Delegates spoke of his insights during committee meetings. His opinions were quoted in policy briefs. Younger diplomats, even from species that once feared him, lined up after sessions to ask for advice. At the same time, Alexandra's reputation soared. She became known as the diplomat who dared. Her methods were studied across the galactic network: direct engagement, emotional intelligence, and relentless curiosity. Not everyone agreed with her approach, but no one could deny its results. The friendship between her and Casthol became something of a legend. They were seen together often in libraries, in cafes, walking through the station's arboretum. There was something striking about the image. The towering armored figure and the composed human ambassador talking softly amid the trees or laughing over a shared joke. For many on the station, it became a symbol. If they could find common ground, what else was possible? The cultural festival that followed was unlike any event the station had ever hosted. Instead of separate pavilions for each species, it was structured around themes: art, music, food, philosophy. Species collaborated, mixing customs, experimenting with rituals, and sharing songs. Casthol gave a demonstration on harmonic resonance, explaining how Vexer architecture responded to emotional states. Alexandra followed with a speech about how empathy could be engineered into public spaces, drawing parallels to human biophilic design. At one point, they danced. Well, danced was generous. It was a Vexer ceremonial movement pattern, measured, flowing, more akin to Tai Chi than traditional dance. Alexandra struggled with the footwork. Casthol, despite his size, moved with surprising grace. When she tripped mid-spin, he caught her without a word. The video of the moment went viral. "Vexer warrior teaches human how to dance without breaking her" was the headline in over 100 systems. By then, the change was irreversible. The Galactic Council, once rigid and fractured by generations of protocol, had become alive. Species that hadn't collaborated in decades were now holding open forums. Former adversaries co-sponsored legislation. Younger delegates introduced proposals focused not on security, but on education and cultural exchange. None of it was perfect. There were setbacks, debates, moments of resistance. But there was also momentum. A new era was emerging. And at its heart stood a friendship that no one had predicted but everyone now believed in. Later, during a quiet evening, on the observation deck, Alexandra turned to Casthol and said, "You know they don't flinch anymore." He nodded. "I have noticed. How does it feel? He took a long moment before answering. Like breathing after being underwater for centuries, she smiled. Told you it was possible. You did, he admitted. And I did not believe you. Still, she said, leaning back in her chair, I bet you missed the intimidation factor a little. Not really, he said with a small rumble of amusement. Though I do miss the silence. They sat in companionable quiet for a while, watching a comet pass near the station's outer edge. Then Castle spoke again. You changed me. Alexandra turned toward him. No. We changed each other, and in that quiet, high above the politics and protocols of the galactic core, two souls, one ancient, one new, watched the stars and understood something vital. Even in a galaxy filled with centuries of fear and history, change wasn't just possible. It had already begun. 1 year after the pirate attack that nearly shattered the Galactic Council, the Chamber no longer looked or felt the same. Where once there had been division, silence, and 1,000 unspoken fears, there was now motion, conversation, and a tentative but growing trust. Even the architecture had changed subtly. The lighting was warmer. The banners that once showcased only military crests now included symbols of culture, knowledge, and unity. A new mural stretched across one wall, abstract and vivid, capturing a swirling tapestry of the species that called the Council home. At the heart of it all stood two figures, Kaz Thol, once the galaxy's most feared warrior, and Alexandra Torres, the diplomat who had dared to speak to him as an equal. Today was a historic session. Delegates filled the chamber with a nervous excitement that hadn't been felt in generations. The agenda item was simple in appearance, yet monumental in scope. The establishment of the Galactic Cultural Exchange Initiative. The Elder, Valara, stood at the center of the chamber, her luminescent form glowing with steady light. The council recognizes Councilmember Kaz Thol of the Vexer Empire. All eyes turned toward the towering warrior as he rose to his full height. But there was something different in how the room received him now. They didn't recoil. They listened. My people, he began, once believed in strength above all. We were protectors, warriors, defenders of peace through force. But long before the wars, we were also something else, builders, artists, teachers. That history was nearly lost. But it was not erased. He glanced toward Alexandra, who nodded once, her expression full of calm encouragement. In collaboration with United Human Systems, he continued, and with the support of the Council, I propose the full unsealing and restoration of the Vexer archives. These documents, our literature, our architecture, our philosophies, will be made accessible to all member species. Let our knowledge serve as a bridge, not a boundary. Whispers swept through the room. Delegates turned to one another with wide eyes. The Vexer archives had been mythologized for centuries, sealed vaults of knowledge never opened, not even during times of galactic crisis. To offer them freely was more than generous. It was revolutionary. Alexandra rose and stood beside Kaz Thol. Her diplomatic uniform now bore not only the emblem of Earth, but a silver crest representing the Vexer, given to her personally by Kaz. In the spirit of mutual respect, she said, her voice clear and deliberate, Earth will also open the Terra Nova Cultural Repository to the galaxy. Together, we will launch educational hubs across the core systems, where the next generation of diplomats and thinkers can learn not just from technology and policy, but from the stories, struggles, and hopes that define us. Applause spread, first tentative, then strong. It was a moment that would be archived, replayed, and studied for centuries. But what mattered more wasn't what happened on the floor of the council chamber, it was what happened after. In the days and weeks that followed, the station itself began to shift in ways both big and small. Delegates from rival species joined cultural working groups. Cafes started offering dishes based on shared culinary experiments between races. Student interns collaborated on language translation projects, and through it all, Alexandra and Kaz remained at the center not as rulers or overseers, but as symbols. They continued meeting on the observation deck, drinking coffee, trading stories, and quietly mentoring anyone brave enough to approach. You sure you want to do this? Alexandra asked one evening as the stars shimmered above them. Kaz nodded. It is time. He had accepted a new role, Director of Intergalactic Cultural Preservation. It meant leaving behind his seat on the council, but it also meant doing something he'd never imagined teaching. I thought I'd spend my last centuries in solitude, he said with a dry smile. Instead, I will be grading essays on Vexer poetic structures. Alexandra laughed. Hey, Just wait until you get your first paper blaming the fall of the Vexer civilization on Mercury retrograde. He tilted his head. Mercury. What? Never mind. Just remember, coffee helps. The first cohort of the Galactic Cultural Exchange Initiative launched 3 months later. It included students from 12 different species, all of them hand-picked based on curiosity, empathy, and resilience. Some came from war-torn colonies, others from distant stations barely connected to the core. But they came not as subjects of diplomacy, they came as learners. Kaz taught the first seminar himself on cultural survival beyond collapse. His lecture wasn't full of dates or battle tactics. It was filled with memory, emotion, truth. He ended the class with a quote not from the Vexer archives, but from Alexandra. Connection doesn't always end in loss. Sometimes it's what helps you survive it. Over time, more mentors joined the program, teachers from various species, each contributing their wisdom. The classrooms weren't just places of learning, they were places of healing. The galaxy was still far from perfect. There were still conflicts, misunderstandings, fear, but the culture had changed. In one particularly moving session, a child from the once warring Trusari and Centurion nations stood on the same stage and performed a song, a fusion of their homeworld's musical styles. At the end of the piece, the child bowed and said, "This is for my parents who never lived to see peace. I sing so their memory will build something new." Kazdul watched from the audience, unmoving. But later he told Alexandra that child sang the truth my people once carried. She reminded me why we fought, and what we forgot. As the years passed, the friendship between the human and the Vexer elder became a permanent thread in the fabric of galactic diplomacy. Their easy banter, their shared habits, and their mutual respect inspired generations. One day, in a quiet corner of the station's botanical garden, Alexandra found Kaz tending to a small earth orchid she'd once given him. "You're getting good at this," she said. "Plants are simpler than diplomacy," he replied, brushing the petals gently. "They do not pretend to be something they are not," she smiled. "And yet you learned to grow again." He looked at her, truly looked. "You showed me that I could." Then, as they often did, they sat together in silence, watching as light filtered through the transparent dome and painted the plants in warm gold. In our own world, stories like this one remind us that even the hardest walls can be softened not by force, but by friendship. That ancient wounds don't have to define the future. That strength, real strength, lies not in how much we can dominate others, but in how deeply we can understand them. We live in a world still full of fear, division, and forgotten voices. Sometimes we build silence around us like armor, believing that isolation will protect us. And yet, the truth remains, the only way forward is together. Whether it's a human sharing coffee with a forgotten warrior, or a child choosing harmony over heritage, or someone choosing to ask a question instead of turning away, these are the acts that change history. Because sometimes the most powerful thing in the galaxy isn't a weapon or a fleet or a seat on a council. Sometimes it's simply the courage to say, "Tell me your story. I want to understand." And that is how legacies are rebuilt. One conversation at a time, one friend at a time, one new beginning at a time.